Welcome back. Let me just say that the participants will be going after this to room 801 in the campus center next door for lunch. And the rest of you, if you don't know the campus, there's excellent lunch goodies in the lower level of the campus center in the blue wall. And we will have an hour or so for that time. We're running behind, partly the conference fault, but we'll make it work. I'd say if you make an effort to be back here at the time it says on the schedule, and we will all do the same. Nicole, who's speaking to us next, Stokes-Dupass, is an associate professor of sociology at Holy Family University in Philadelphia. Her research focuses on the state, international migration, citizenship, social integration in the Scandinavian and European states. She's published 2 books, Integration and New Limits in Citizenship Rights, Denmark and Beyond, and co-authored Citizenship, Belonging, and Nation States in the 21st Century, both titles with Gregory Macmillan. Her most recent co-authored book, Nation States, Securitized Borders and Rapidly Changing Policies in the Age of Mass Migration, is forthcoming in 2018. Welcome, Nicole.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Should I move? Okay, sorry.
We can't see you.
Well, I can't see you either, so that's fair enough. Okay, is this better? And can everyone hear me okay? Okay, perfect. Oh, that's much better for all of us.
It's good.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you very much for organizing this symposium. I've learned a lot in the past 24 hours, and I'm glad that all of our presentations and papers really do complement each other quite well. So thank you to our organizers for that. This topic is, let me put my disclaimer out there. This is a work in progress, and it's an area, securitization is not an area of specialty for me. But again, given the recent Syrian crisis, it's becoming one. So I am still untangling some of these issues. So I'm hoping that I will get some good comments and discussion from you all as well. In recent years, there's been, again, a lot of media and scholarly discourse about citizenship, issues of belonging. My field, sociology, when we study this, if we study the state, we often study it from the perspective of access to things that the state confers. Experiences of citizenship, access to citizenship, feelings of belonging or inclusion. We rarely look at the state or nation state the way political scientists typically look at it, as an entity and the unit of analysis. So keep that in mind as you hear my talk. Most sociologists do not do this. So again, in recent years, there's been a considerable discourse about the role of the nation state, and particularly in sociological discourse. And the recent conversation is really looking at what could seem as contradictory objectives. On the one hand, to secure its territory, and that's post-9/11 thinking. And then, on the other hand, to create the necessary conditions for inclusion and belonging for all who reside. And this is becoming the assimilation or integration, and they are separate conversations, discourse. And the nation state somehow is supposed to manage and balance the two. And so this is becoming the tension that the most recent Syrian refugee migration is really bringing to bear. So in this paper, which will undoubtedly become 2 papers, I'm examining the respective Danish, Norwegian, and Swedish responses to the recent Syrian refugee crisis, using the framework of Hannah Arendt's classic theory on statelessness. And in this, I explore legislation, social policies that have been created by the nation state in order to tighten borders and securitize what would have been historically and traditionally a humanitarian approach or response. And I argue that these recent legislative and restrictive policies and legislative changes represent an era of heightened securitization of borders, which by design, as we heard yesterday, is designed to restrict the movement of the most recent group of migrants, Syrian refugees, into Scandinavia. The increased securitization measures, though, and I think this is where the critical conversation in sociology is going to move, this new period of securitization is really challenging the traditional trajectory and function of citizenship as a concept, particularly citizenship by naturalization, for migrants, and I am arguing it will increase the vulnerability of already vulnerable populations and increase those who will be statelessness by default. So again, I focus on the nation state and the role of state actors because I argue they're the ones who have the ultimate authority in terms of movement and status of migrants. The state permits entry or non-entry. The state has the ability to say whether you can stay, reside, or you have to return home. The state also can provide subsequent pathways to naturalization if it so chooses. So again, in sociology, it does take some convincing to tell my folks the nation state is the unit of analysis in considering all of these concepts and bringing them together. So in my previous works, as I said, I have continued to argue that it's the nation state that determines ultimately who has the right to have rights. And the amount of rights will vary depending on which category of migrants you're talking about, or domestic populations. Right? We were having a conversation at coffee over how to consider ethnic populations born in those societies, right? Or people who have naturalized who are no longer captured in terms of statistical data. They are ethnic, but they are citizens. So again, all of these categories will have differing levels of access to rights or the right to have rights. Migrants, denizens, long-term resident populations, and the newest group, refugees. And different categories of refugees, depending on the geopolitical events that brought them there. Nation states, as I said, again, for political scientists, this is nothing new. Nation states are sovereign. They have, again, ultimate right to govern. But I think the conversation in sociology definitely has moved towards this idea of post-nationalism, right? The idea that national organizations like the EU have the potential to melt away the power of the nation state. At least that's the conversation in my discipline. And I think we are now moving towards saying the refugee crisis is a good example of how nation state sovereignty has been reasserted, especially in the area of citizenship and the control of movement of people. And specifically shaping the integration outcomes. So yesterday we spent a lot of time untangling immigration policy versus integration policy. And I argue strongly that the nation state is really the ultimate determiner of what are the outcomes for these various categories of migrants and their respective processes towards integration. So theoretical positioning, as I mentioned before, this paper, and it will be papers, is really situated in a very vast field of literature on citizenship, the state, migration. And again, in this context, I blend these concepts to talk about securitization. And again, the idea of the policy specifically in Scandinavia is designed, again, to secure borders and tighten immigration policy. But on the ground, these new laws are also really widening the divide of rights among those categories of people I just outlined. And Danish political scientist Ole Weaver's 1995 term, he coined the term securitization. And he defined it then as the process of moving an issue from the realm of typical politics to the realm of the exception. And according to Weaver, securitization really occurs in three distinct phases. There's the identification of an actor as a potential threat. The potential is then specified as a real threat that requires an immediate countermeasure. And then finally, the successful cultivation of that fear coupled with the acceptance of this perception by the mass audience. And so what I argue using Weaver's framework is to say the refugee crisis has really experienced all three stages of securitization in terms of this conversation. And again, the purpose of this paper is focused on refugees specifically because this recent conflict represents a true shift away from humanitarian responses, which Greta's paper perfectly outlined that Sweden specifically was the largest absorber of refugee populations in the region. And even Sweden has shifted in terms of away from what would have been a humanitarian response to mass migration to now thinking in terms of a securitized response and having that be coupled with what to do in terms of a humanitarian approach. And so again, I argue that this is the reassertion of state sovereignty in this area. and especially in the wake of a lack of an EU, a unified EU response to this crisis. Every nation state is still sort of grappling with what to do, and the what to do is becoming or being interpreted more as a securitized response. So again, I argue that the refugees, being the most vulnerable population, it's making it even more difficult for them to secure denizen status, which would have been the traditional trajectory. And then, again, with denizen status, there would have been a future pathway to citizenship by naturalization. And I'm arguing that it's becoming more and more distant. In her classic work, Origins of Totalitarianism, Arendt really also coined the term statelessness and aptly described the conditions associated with this status. Even Arendt in 1948 was skeptical about the enthusiasm of the nation state to champion the plight of those who are stateless, and the enforcement capacity of international laws to compel them to do so. And despite this, Arendt was also one of the first post-national scholars to express some hopefulness that a commitment to human rights and a commitment to move society away from the atrocities of World War II would guarantee particularly the right to nationality. And her hope was that that would transcend state sovereignty and keep national borders open to society's most vulnerable. So, building on Arendt's classic work and later work by Caroline Sawyer and Brad Blitz, where they argued the conditions of statelessness are really not new. But what is new is that the stateless population is growing and becoming more and more displaced and unwanted, and more commonly undocumented refugees, because the scale of geopolitical events continue to rise, and without recognition of those geopolitical events, refugees often cannot come in documented, meaning they have permissions to enter. And that's the piece that's new. As we mentioned before, documented refugees, again, are created by the recognition of those geopolitical events, albeit, again, at differing levels. They come with status, rights, protections, and, again, potential pathways to citizenship by naturalization. And as more and more host nations become unwilling or fearful to accept refugees as a result of these geopolitical events, undocumented refugees who illegally enter nation states will continue to rise. So Sawyer and Blitz aptly distinguish between what they call de jure, documented, or de facto undocumented statelessness. And again, they argue that and again, they wrote before the Syrian refugee crisis, it is worse now. So they were looking at events that have happened really in the middle 2000s to about 2010 is their data lag. So today, if they were updating this book, they certainly would say the Syrian refugee crisis has certainly advanced their argument considerably. So in my paper, I argue that there are two factors that really highlight this tension between humanitarian and securitized responses. First, as we said before, the rapid and seemingly unending displacement of Syrian refugees throughout Europe. And then second, recent tragic events in Europe that have been called acts of terrorism, right? And so in terms of the first factor, the displacement and migration of Syrian refugees, it's important again to note that many European nations are grappling with how best to handle this crisis. And there have been a number of strategies that have been suggested in terms of burden sharing, right, associated with its management. And all of these nations are looking for a solution that doesn't put any one nation state over its capacity in terms of the ability to incorporate these populations into their societies. That said, as I mentioned before, becoming a documented refugee is a status, again, often created with recognition of geopolitical events by global actors. So again, if there's no recognition, there can be no deployment of the international human rights laws that are designated to grant these populations protections and status and rights within their receiving host nation. So this status, as I mentioned before, is supposed to grant documented refugees with a series of protections and pathways. But again, there are competing pressures that are leading once generous nations to begin to close their borders and limit those pathways, thus restricting the legal avenues to asylum and therefore leading to a rise in statelessness by de facto, or by default, sorry. So again, as I mentioned before, statelessness is not a new concept. Again, it's defined as people who, in a legal sense, are without a nation-state identity. And again, immediately following World War II, international actors at the UN, General Assembly in Paris created everyone knows, the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And this is still held as the premier document that was signed by most countries in Europe, including Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, and the United States. And specifically, it references Article 15, which prohibits statelessness and grants all individuals the right to nationality. Now, in addition to the Human Rights Declaration, there are a number of international laws and conventions that also apply to stateless populations, and in the paper, I discuss them in greater detail. But here, it's important to note that, again, many legal scholars and social scientists debate the robustness of these rights and protections, and specifically the question of the enforcement capacity of these laws. What entities, if any, has the ultimate authority to adjudicate claims by documented refugees of violations or abuses associated with the denial of both status and rights by host nations and the political actors within them? And that's a big question mark. So again, as Greta and Eric in their respective presentations pointed out yesterday, Scandinavia really isn't a newcomer to the idea of migration and being a receiving nation for various groups of immigrants. However, the new, if there is a newness, is that Scandinavia is new to the quote-unquote problems associated with specific categories of people migrating. And some of those problems I put in quotations on purpose are associated with assimilation and integration. And those are concepts that in other works I have untangled. Oftentimes they are intertwined and they're not the same. Assimilation, as many of you probably know, is where the minority group takes on characteristics of the dominant group, right, in an effort to, quote, blend in and become part of the dominant group ultimately. Integration, though, and again, this is a concept that's contested. There are some who argue that integration is a process of learning some of the components of the dominant group, but it becomes almost like cultural fusion, where there's some interpretation that look at it as the process eventually will reinvent and become in tandem. You're learning the components of the dominant group, but you're also retaining some of the components of your original identity. And again, I put a big question mark there too, because as we debate the operational definition of integration, integration policies reflect many of those interpretations of that concept. So that's not something I deal with in this paper, but it's something I would like to note here. Again, back to the newness. Many of these countries, as I mentioned before, has enjoyed a long and very distinctive reputation of being very progressive, especially in the area of gender and sexuality, social policies, and of course the welfare state, which we talked about yesterday. But another growing reputation is also brewing, becoming some of the most inhospitable destinations for migrants, particularly Denmark and Norway, and as we learned yesterday, Sweden also starting to take a more, Greta put it nicely, not a hostile stance in terms of its marketing, but maybe in terms of its policy. While diversity in terms of immigration and rising ethnic populations has really resulted, if we look at the hard numbers, from previous waves of migration. We talked about guest workers yesterday, but the next generations of those guest workers and their descendants, and also their spousal and familial reunification. That's the biggest chunk of ethnic populations throughout most of Scandinavia. But of course, much of the media discourse and much of the public discourse is focused on newer waves. And specifically now, of course, the refugee populations and conflicts in Syria. So in terms of figures, it's estimated that the conflict in Syria has resulted in more than 4 million refugees moving into neighboring states throughout Europe, with more than 50,000 Syrian children being born in exile since the conflicts began in 2011. As we mentioned before, Sweden has been the most generous of the Nordic countries in terms of accepting large numbers of refugees, and also in terms of citizenship by naturalization policies in previous waves of refugees. And for the past decade, really, Sweden has been perceived by its Nordic neighbors as an immigration backdoor. Because as Eric's presentation pointed out, through Nordic agreements and economic agreements, if one were to acquire Swedish citizenship, then it meant movement throughout the Nordic countries because of the agreements. And so there's been external pressure on Sweden to tighten up its immigration policy, but then also to start to focus its integration policy more on kind of assimilationist definitions of that concept. And Sweden is starting to respond to some of that pressure from outside. So I mentioned the second factor, so that was the first factor. The second factor are, of course, the recent events that have been described as acts of terrorism. And throughout Europe, but most also specifically in Denmark, the Copenhagen shootings, and of course most recently Brussels, and it seems like every day there's something new happening there. But of course the signature event was the Charlie Hebdo shootings in January of 2015, and a month after that was the shooting at, shots were fired at a Copenhagen cafe by Omar Abel Abid El Hussein, who was a 22-year-old Danish-born Muslim man, and he fired shots into the cafe. It was an event that was organized really in response to Charlie Hebdo. But the event was going to feature Lasvik, who most of you know is gained infamy because of the cartoonist who put those controversial drawings in the Jyllands-Posten. And so again, there were debates again about whether or not the drawing should have been published at all, but this young man fired into the crowd as an act of, he said later, saying that I'm shooting at somebody who drew the offensive pictures. In the aftermath of this event, though, really the conversation shifted. And it shifted toward, and it was interesting reading comments from the former Danish Prime Minister, Helle Thorning-Schmidt, and she concluded that we'd have to come up with new solutions to a threat of extremism. And I wanted to read her quote. She says, quote, "As a nation, we have experienced a series of hours we will never forget. We have tasted the ugly fear of powerlessness and the terror that it would like to create. But we also, as a society, have answered back." And she was specifically referring to policy and legislative changes that were happening in the Danish parliament to, again, further restrict access to entry on one end, and also further lengthen citizenship requirements, citizenship by naturalization. And following these two incidents, again, a lot of the discourse has shifted towards securitization mechanisms. So in other works, there has been, again, conversation around this increased, growing, quote-unquote, Muslim presence. And I put that in quotations on purpose. As I mentioned before, nation states have competing pressures of being both open, but also, quote, secure. And it's, again, leading once generous nations to begin to move in a direction toward restricting legal avenues. And in Scandinavia, this concept of securitization has been tied to, or Jorgen Nelson in his work tied it to this notion of the quote-unquote Muslim presence. And he talked about, there's always been a Muslim presence in the region, but he specifically talks about a more nuanced conversation in post-9/11 of the need to, again, move towards what he called, he said, again, there were people in the region who have practiced Islam, but migrating and residing in Scandinavia consistently for the past 4 decades. Again, Eric's presentation talked about guest worker programs. But Nelson highlights that, again, what's new is the quickening pace and also the need towards this idea of greater scrutiny. And he specifically references scrutiny of migrants in the last 15 years, and specifically looking at family reunification and questioning sort of the validity of those. So the sham marriages, Greta mentioned in her presentation the 24-year rule, that policy has moved in a direction of greater scrutiny for particularly Muslim populations, and questioning the validity of the need for spousal reunification, visa and applications and so on. So he says it's not that the presence is new, but the way in which they are screened, the way in which they are monitored through the processes of gaining entry and also residency and later citizenship by naturalization. He argues the scrutiny is what is new and is a function of the post-9/11 era. So again, tying back to Weaver's concept of securitization, Nelson also argues that this sharp increase made religion suddenly an issue, in quotations, and an issue for political actors and native populations in Scandinavia to unpack. And we had a little bit of that conversation yesterday. But Dilson, I like his work because he really says that if we really tease at whatever it is, the it is the practice of Islam and the way in which it makes it very difficult for someone who practices that religion and is a faithful practitioner of that religion to integrate in a way that makes them seamlessly Danish, Swedish, or Norwegian. And so he starts to sort of unpack some of those pieces of religion as a variable. So let me switch to Sweden, which is of course the focus of our symposium. So again, the position of Sweden and as we talked about, has really changed quite a bit, and it's represented the most intriguing shift. As Greta pointed out in her presentation, previously Sweden, again, would have aligned more with the current conversation now happening in Germany. Right? Sweden would have sought out a unified, quote, European solution to the Syrian refugee crisis. And the recent shift towards searching for independent solutions, again, may be a result of those internal and external pressures that I was talking about. In terms of numbers, more than 160,000 asylum seekers have arrived to Sweden since 2015, and the highest per capita rate among the EU member states. In the paper, I have a chart with each member state. Denmark and Norway, as we have been hearing, has taken a more hardline approach, more similar to Austria, if we were to align them to the conversations happening now, where the proverbial drawbridges are up in terms of tightening borders, restrictive social policies, and again, unlike its Nordic neighbors, Sweden has had the longest history with being an immigrant receiving nation from kind of non-traditional places, if I could put it under that umbrella. And as we mentioned in Greta's presentation, of course, Sweden was the first in the region to look for guest workers for labor shortages during the 1960s and 70s. Again, and we also saw in Greta's presentation, Swedish integration policy, again, traditionally set expectations for assimilation, which required a certain degree of conformity to Swedish cultural norms and values, but again, placed very few structural impediments to those who sought out either denizen status or citizenship by naturalization. And that has changed, as again, Greta's presentation pointed out yesterday. So again, despite complicated and seemingly contradictory legislation, again, Sweden has often been celebrated internationally as being one of the most amenable places for migrants and ethnic populations. And over the years, as we said, the political and social discourse on multiculturalism has shifted in the opposite direction. Also, public support in Sweden for many of these policies is beginning to wane a bit. There are some minor voices, but voices that are becoming more powerful on the nationalistic side or nationalistic viewpoints among Swedes and conservative political posturing that has emerged really since the 1990s, but is becoming more and more pronounced with the most recent crisis. And it's interesting to watch this change unfold. So as this paper continues, and of course with the most recent events happening now in Sweden, this section of the paper is still being written. As every day, Cheryl's been sending us articles of events as they're unfolding. The Danish case, which of course I know more intimately, and I'm going to be very brief here, But the Social Democrats political party, again, supposedly the moderate party, launched a very interesting media campaign, first targeted towards ethnic minority populations in Denmark, and as the top ad features the former prime minister. And in Danish, of course, it loosely translates to, if you come to Denmark, you must work, of course. And again, this is not new. As many of you heard in yesterday's presentation by Eric, the focus on work activation is not new. But what is interesting is this ad was reworked recently, and it has included some pieces about, it was put up in airports and train stations in receiving countries like Syria, Northern Africa, Tunisia, and a number of other places, basically alluding to, don't come to Denmark, it's closed. And so this sort of movement towards restriction is interesting with, again, the specific focus on the most recent crisis. During the recent elections, now almost a year, former Prime Minister was running for a second term, and during a televised event, she was asked a question, do you believe that Denmark is a multicultural society? And very quickly she answered, I don't know if others saw this interview, she says, no, we are not. She said, how do you think that, and the person asking the question said, how do you think that affects the minorities when they hear their prime minister and the opposition candidate say that? And she says, her response was, Denmark is Danish. It will remain Danish. We welcome people, but they must become Danish. And that was her response. So I thought that was a very interesting way to respond to the question of, is it a multicultural society? And as Greta pointed out, Denmark and Norway have never postured themselves that way. So, some thoughts. And again, I said this is a work in progress. Some of the things that I am grappling with here is, again, respective to Danish and Norwegian and Swedish responses to the crisis. I think the tie that binds, and again, I'd be curious to hear your feedback on this, is this focus on securitization measures. I'm approaching it from the perspective of looking at discourse and doing discourse analysis, and then policy analysis. Is the discourse shaping the way in which the policies emerge? So is it becoming more and more restrictive as the discourse becomes increasingly negative, or focused particularly on this notion of perceived or real, quote, threats? So again, I thank you for your time. I welcome questions or comments. Thank you. I don't know who, oh, Eric's responding to me, oh boy.
First shot, yeah. Okay, that was.
It's on.
Okay, thank you very much, Nicole, and these are themes, some of these themes Nicole and I have been discussing for probably almost 10 years now, so we've seen things change. I want to make this is a very detailed paper, and I'm not going to respond to every, and it's also, there are parts of it that are more developed than others, but I'm going to respond just sort of selectively, and then maybe in the question and answer, other points can come up. There are a few interesting things to put in mind. First of all, the statelessness situation. The history of statelessness is complex, and I don't know it entirely, but I do know that historically, we go back to roughly the end of World War I, when the breakup of the European empires and the creation of new states, mostly Central and Eastern Europe, plus the moving of borders between France and Germany, and Denmark and Germany, and so on, created this rather complex situation of people whose nationality was changing. More so for one, I had a graduate student from Lithuania a few years ago, and she explained that her parents have lived in 4 different countries without ever moving. It's just that the borders have moved. They live in Vilnius, and that is a part of Lithuania that has changed nationality many times. At any rate, the creation creation by the League of Nations at the time and by the International Red Cross was something called the Nansen Passport, named after the Norwegian explorer and humanitarian Fridtjof Nansen, who did a lot of relief work like Herbert Hoover did in post-World War I Europe. And the idea of statelessness, unfortunately, became worse before it became better, because as we know, several of the regimes in Europe, elsewhere perhaps, but in Europe I'm more familiar, deprived their would-be citizens of citizenship. They canceled their citizenship. Most dramatically, it was in Nazi Germany, where Jews were eventually deprived of German nationality and became stateless as a result. The other parts of the world, there were similar turmoil. And so a lot of the post-World War II that Nicole refers to, the Universal Declaration, the 1950, I think it was 1951 or 2, the refugee conventions and subsequent ones, were in many ways a response to the World War II situation. Now, in practice, of course, as I mentioned yesterday, after World War II, there was even larger number of displaced persons, most of whom were resettled without too much drama sooner or later. But the idea of statelessness and of citizenship and of the rights of refugees became, of course, much more formalized. And I suspect that Hannah Arendt's theories are based on her own personal experience, having been a refugee just before the outbreak of World War II. The question is, what is the way that one handles not just individual or small cases of refugees, of political asylum seekers who are marked by their individual actions for a repression in some countries, and the ability to flee to other countries is, of course, both humanitarian and politically very important. But one of the points we mentioned yesterday, and that Nicole goes into much more detail, is that the category of migrant is really a very complex one today, as is indeed the idea of refugee, of citizen, of, she uses Thomas Hammer's somewhat funny word, denizen, as I would call it, permanent resident, but at any rate, denizen, let us say a person living as a foreigner indefinitely, which there are many people in the United States who are permanent residents for a very long time. There's at least one in this room that I know of. At any rate, there are all these different categories of citizenship. Brings us really to the next question: what does it mean to be a citizen nowadays? And this is even more complex given the first Nordic agreements about the movement of Nordic citizens from one country to the other, now made much more complex by the European Union, which has a whole series of provisions to allow the free movement of labor or the free movement of persons, originally rather strictly defined as the right to seek a job from one European Union country to another, but now involving families and even people without citizenship, the right, if they're accepted resident of, say, France, their right to, say, move to Germany and vice versa. Excuse me. So you have this increasingly complex notion of citizenship and of residency. One point that Nicole doesn't fully develop in this paper, she might want to in another version, is the strange situation of multiple citizenship, so dual citizenship. When you think about it, in some ways, dual citizenship should not exist. Well, you can change citizenship, but you sort of only can salute one flag at a time. In fact, that's not the case. In fact, everyone in my immediate family is a dual citizen except me, for a variety of reasons, and it does involve at times some rather strange categories. And it even becomes an issue with multiple voting. Some of you who've been reading the paper know that there's been a great deal of controversy in Western Europe when the president of Turkey has been trying to recruit large numbers of votes for his referendum, because he doesn't think the Turks want it, but he thinks that foreign Turks might want it, to create, of course, to concentrate power in his own hands. And he has been treated not entirely with warm welcome in many, as he campaigns, if that's the right, campaigns among overseas or foreign Turks who retain the right to vote. And in this country, we've had occasional issues about Mexicans. Mexicans in this country keeping the right to vote in Mexico. And who knows, this may spread. Americans living permanently abroad have the right to vote. As voting rules become increasingly strict in this country, who knows whether that too will be a case. I guess right now, I just heard yesterday that the state of New Hampshire, New Hampshire legislature is trying to restrict voters to prove that they intend to live they've lived in New Hampshire for 30 days and intend to continue to live. They're worried about the flood of migrants from Massachusetts spilling over the border and occupying their formerly Republican state. At any rate, so the idea of citizenship even becomes increasingly complex as we develop these various rules. One point that Breda and I made yesterday in passing is that the Scandinavian welfare states have been fine-tuning many of their programs, like pensions and other benefits, to now take into account residency because of the fact that people are moving across borders in such large numbers, including their own citizens, and there are issues about whether or not the universality of the Scandinavian welfare state is being modified significantly to take into account this kind of flexibility. At any rate, these are all interesting themes that Nicole develops here, and I don't want to dwell on it too much because she's done a good job here and even in summarizing it. Securitization, that is to say the security threat, again is an issue to deal with a variety of issues. First of all, of course, there is the belief and the occasional fact that there are people who intend to create violence or threats who move across international borders. Actually, as we know, many of the terrorist acts, including the nasty one in England a few days ago, are often created by, you might say, native born people who are alienated in one way or another. And that, of course, is true in the case in Denmark that Nicole mentioned. But again, the issue of law enforcement and of security is a problem because we do know that open borders make fighting crime and managing even human rights, human trafficking and other problems much more difficult to maintain. And for example, Denmark has had the very strange situation of, on the one hand, being very concerned about open borders and too much access, but also not wanting the European Union to become a kind of law enforcement mechanism. So the Danes have been trying to negotiate a special agreement because one of their opt-outs from the European Union dating back to 1992 is that they do not have to cooperate on police matters, but they want to cooperate, but they don't want to change their opt-out. So it's a very difficult situation. Basically, like most human beings, the Danes want their cake and eat it too. So that is an issue of security that's very important. The Syrian case that Nicole discusses, of course, is especially dramatic because of the size and number and the obvious situation that Syrians find themselves in, which is beyond dispute. But of course, it's part of the larger migrant question. If you actually look at the details of who arrives in Europe by very dangerous means and various mechanisms, it's a much more complex picture. Yes, Syrians are not as overwhelming, except for 2015, as you might think. There's still very large numbers of other migrants, many of whom may have a less clear case of asylum and refugee status, and that's a difficult case to manage. First of all, there's the issue of how do you have enough information? How can you verify various stories? Some of the migrants do destroy their papers to make it more difficult. And then, of course, if their asylum is rejected, how do you get them back or out, whatever the goal is? And this is something that we mentioned yesterday, and I don't want to go into too much detail, but it really creates this permanent case of large numbers of people who have a de facto form of statelessness, as Nicole pointed out. There's much more even in the paper than I can get in here. There's a reference to some of the more spectacular or controversial issues, such as the jewelry tax that some that the BBC has been obsessed with, in the New York Times. They assume that Denmark is living off of confiscated jewelry. And of course it was a typically bad public relations, because people being shaken upside down to empty their pockets. But in fact, I think the number of people who've actually had property confiscated is somewhere in the age of 5 or fewer. And in one case, it was some Iranians who had a suitcase full of money. The issue here, of course, is that in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, the ability to receive public assistance is dependent on not having one's own means, but it was very clumsily put into effect, and not very good timing of a crackdown. But it is part of this policy, which the Social Democrats a little more softly, but the non-socialists have been much more forceful. Don't come here, or don't think it's going to be easy if you get here. And that has been, of course, an issue of controversy. Again, Denmark being the most strict, but also given its geographic location, essentially the first stop. Norway less so, and Sweden, until very recently, avoided some of those issues. Okay, I think I'm going to stop now and let other people raise other questions. I've touched on many of the very fine things here, and I'll let Nicole direct it from there. Or maybe I'll run around with the microphone if I can. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Don't, please.
Thank you for the paper, Nicole, and I think one great thing about this is that it's an opportunity for Scandinavia to show that it matters in kind of global, with broader discussions of citizenship and statelessness. We have a case study here that should be of relevance to a wide range of scholars. You're touching upon that. I applaud your instinct to reassert the importance of the nation states as a sociologist, and you list some reasons why that's important to do. If your goal is ultimately, as you said at the end of the paper, to analyze the linkages and divergences between political discourse and policy, alongside paying attention to the importance of the nation state, I would also suggest thinking about the ways that political discourse messaging, especially messaging abroad, can be perpetuated by political forces outside of the most formal avenues of power. And I think that the key case study for that is in Sweden. We talked about how the Danish government were sending these signals formally to potential areas of immigration, sending the message that Denmark is not this attractive place to immigrate to. That happened in Sweden too, but of course not from its governing administration. It happens by an outside anti-immigrant party that acted on its own behalf amid a great deal of criticisms. Spread out a bunch of leaflets, published them, and had them distributed in Greece with variously unlettered statements about what life in Sweden is like and what they could expect as migrants. So that was one comment that I had, is to be comprehensive in the ways that some of the opponents of multiculturalism and immigration might be communicating.
You want to respond at this point?
Okay, I can, well, I'll respond to a couple points that Eric made, and he is correct to note that parts of this paper is more developed than others. It started out as really a theoretical paper to sort of conjoin schools of thought that were, or conversations that are happening in sociology that don't explore the linkages across. So it started, and if you read the paper, it reads very heavy on theory on the front end of the paper, because that was the original goal, was to move my discipline a bit more towards stop talking about citizenship and not talking about the state. Stop talking about the state and not talking about migration. These things are connected. So that was the original goal. And then I moved more, again, with this paper is evolving as the events are evolving. So I think it's going to eventually become probably it needs to be three different things. And the feedback I got from another talk was, you have the tale of three papers in this paper. And it's true. So what I'd like to do in response to much of what you've said is the last component of looking at the responses in the discourse, moving towards policy decisions as a separate entity. And then the theoretical paper moving sort of more of that conceptualizing and thinking through our concepts in ways that take into account the linkages across. So, yes, is my very, I agree with both sets of comments.
Okay.
It's interesting to contrast this with the opposite. That is, attempts by countries to bring their citizens home, or the effect that arrived at whether they wanted to come home or not. Thinking of the Greeks ejecting the Turks ejecting the Greeks in 1921, right? The Armenian, well, what to call it, the Turks disagree, but the driving Armenians out of Turkey at one point. In the 1930s, the Nazis wanted the scattered colonies in Eastern Europe to become Heimatreich, right? So there was a time in 20th century history where the opposite occurred. Get our citizens back into our boundaries. Now, other citizens are coming into their boundaries.
When we're doing a real historical study, I think you might also go back to the complex situation of both the French and British empires when they were unraveling, finally, empire in the 50s and 60s mainly, how Britain, I know the French case as well, but Britain tightened up the definition of British citizenship. You can be a British citizen but not entitled to move to Britain as part of the empire. And of course, many of you may know Australians or Canadians and others. I remember when I was a student in England in the 60s, just when this came into effect, Canadian friends said, well, they were very happy to have us come in 1914 and 1940, but they don't want us to come now. You know, even quite white ethnically related people have found their rights changed. And on the other hand, you get French people who say they threw us out of North Africa, but now they all want to come to France. So there's a kind of you know, complex relationship here that doesn't follow simple historical categories.
No.
Other comments or questions here? Stretching the wire.
I don't think it goes to Greta. Oh, okay. Yeah.
So thanks again for your discussion of this. I want to bring the conversation hopefully to one point that you mentioned, which I found really exciting. Kind of the idea of, you mentioned viewing migrants and refugees as potential citizens instead of a threat, and that sort of, right, which I find really interesting, especially kind of, this reminds me of a discussion that I feel like has been coming up in a lot of different spaces, sort of the idea of opportunity versus problem.
Yes.
And I think that part of that, at least some part of it, is sort of then linked to empathy versus sympathy. You know, if you kind of talk about people without including them in the discussion. And so I've got a couple of things to say. I've been kind of scrolling all over this. I apologize. I might ramble a bit, but I think it'll kind of tie into this quite nicely, hopefully. You know, one thing was I was at the World Summit for Nobel Peace Laureates in Bogota this year. And one thing that I found really interesting was, they've had this bloody civil war for 57 years. And finally, it seems like Juan Manuel Santos kind of saw this as an opportunity, not as a problem. Sort of, we are in a bad situation, but that means we can get to a better situation. And sort of looking at, how can we bring all of these isolated groups, migrants from other countries who are now living here, how can we sort of pull everyone into the public sphere and bring everyone up to a sort of better level instead of just having it be these disparate, colonies of different people who are all pissed off at each other. And then another thing that kind of came up at this conference was talking about climate change and how very often it's kind of viewed like this threat multiplier, they described it as, this one laureate described it as, saying, well, if we don't address climate change, you're inherently also affecting biodiversity, you're affecting human health, you're affecting all of these things, and how scary is that, right? At the same time, on the flip side of that coin, you've got a solution multiplier. If you really just directly tackle this problem, you can solve a lot of ancillary problems. And so, kind of coming back into the Scandinavian context, where we looked at, even just yesterday, about, some problems with aging population, and some labor shortages we've kind of been discussing. And this kind of reminds me of, I was sitting in a cafe in Stockholm reading Boston Consulting Group's Nordic Report, which they release every year. And it's sort of like, because they have offices all over and they work with all these different businesses, so they kind of do big data analysis of what are the problems, how can we solve them? And of course it's from a business perspective, but that said, it's still valuable. And one of the things that they mentioned for the 2016 report basically called for upwards of 100,000 immigrants to Sweden to help sort of maintain the robustness of the health and tech industries and whatnot. And so, and then of course outside of just directly health and directly tech, there's these auxiliary industries and opportunities for growth within the region as well. And so that kind of makes me think about a couple of things. There are people who, some examples, for instance, there's a company here in the United States, originally a healthcare company. They've recognized, well, we've got all these refugees here. There's also a big problem of translation in courtrooms and in hospitals. So what if we could train refugees to become translators, get high-paying jobs, become integrated more quickly into society? They feel like they're doing a service now in this new country, and it really kind of, there's a really high return on investment for a small sort of upfront educational cost. And so I'm sort of wondering, if all of these migrants were contributing to the societies that they're a part of, obviously in this context we're talking about Scandinavia, would people care about things like color or religion? Or is it more just that they're fixating on something, about them that's different, really just because they feel like they're not contributing to the society or to the welfare state? And so I'm thinking, why, maybe not why, but how can we move to sort of a discussion about how to maybe restore the dignity and sense of purpose of a lot of these refugees, to sort of shift this not to a discussion of how can we deal with this problem, and just sort of put them all in camps in the meantime, but sort of like how can we bring, and I mentioned yesterday kind of about bringing these different actors together, but sort of how can we sort of restore those rights and dignity and purpose, which I argue would probably be the quickest way to integration. In a lot of senses, and then that's kind of been proven, especially in Colombia. From 2015, tens of thousands of people died in the war. 2016, 0 people died. So it's very, very drastic and abrupt once you sort of bring everyone to the table and talk about how they can all kind of come together. So that's something I'm kind of wondering about. If we can sort of move that discussion that way, and what other people think about that.
Wow, that's a lot to us. Okay, so first of all, I love that you ask big questions and are not afraid to ask big research questions. I love that, because I too am a fan of big questions, and then it takes me epic time to unpack all those big questions. But this is sort of, this key point, I make this more pointedly and I'm not plugging my first book, but my first book, which was based on my dissertation, I do make this point much more overtly. And I saw the potential, writing that book was when the Dansk Folkeparti Party, the elections were happening in Denmark, and while the conversations were happening in the region, certainly from the early 1990s into the mid-1990s, it sort of hit a crescendo, 1999, early 2000s, and into the middle of the 2000s. And so I saw, being there and living in Denmark when that was happening, I saw an opportunity, especially coming from the tradition of studying Scandinavian welfare states. I said, okay, you have the same, everybody, all Western welfare states have the same problem. Aging populations, as Greta talked about, especially in terms of the Nordic model, maintenance of the universality of the system, and also the high costs associated with the system as you have more people accessing it and fewer people paying into it. And so immediately, coming out of the tradition of race and migration literature, I said, this is a solution. Like you said, if you are recruiting, and at the time, this has changed a bit, but at the early 2000s, really Denmark was cherry picking the people coming into it. Most of my respondents, and Eric could speak to this from my dissertation, this was the cream of the crop. These were people who were highly educated, who came as through spousal reunification. They were married or partnered with native Danes. They had English proficiency at an extraordinarily high level, which again is a bridge language on their way to Danish proficiency. This was the cream of the crop, and they too struggled in most of the markers of integration. And so then as I started unpacking that and meeting more respondents with less social capital, it's more pronounced. So I think your solution is a brilliant one, and many of my respondents with less social capital found work in informal ways, much of what you've described, translation work or work for international companies, sort of with Peter's, the Copenhagen Press, the Post rather, is a similar sort of place where international companies advertise and say, we don't care if you're a New Dane, come work for us. And many of my respondents found, years later, I've kept up with them, they found work that way. So, yes, is the quick answer. I think we will need to move the conversation away from here, because my fear with writing a securitization paper, and my co-author comes out of a criminal justice background, and we have this conversation a lot. We don't want to write a handbook on how to securitize your borders. Or, you know, we really are struggling with, because we don't come from that tradition in our writings. We would like to reframe the conversation to say, yes, we have real threats. No one denies that in a post-9/11 world, as Eric said in his response to my paper, real events are happening every day. My students and I were just in Paris the week before what happened in Orly, and in London the week before what happened most recently. But at the same time, I don't want us to become crippled with fear, that we turn societies into something else. I don't want to live in a world where I'm checking my papers at the border. Or at the cafe to verify my identity everywhere I go. I think securitization is becoming like hysteria. And so our goal is to reframe the conversation, to think, especially citizenship scholars, to move and think toward the potential role of citizens and new citizens specifically to answer some of the problems and challenges we have with social policy and aging populations and sustainability of our systems. So, yes.
Just let me add one little additional detail. One of the ongoing and actually quite long-running debates in Denmark, and I think Norway as well, I don't know Sweden, has been whether or not refugees should be allowed to work, and whether or not, particularly those whose status is still undefined, should be just, housed basically, and not quite under prison conditions, but under restrictive conditions, or whether or not they should be allowed, at least to a limited degree, to move into the society as a whole. And it's an ongoing issue. I think the most skeptical, let's say the most restrictive political forces really see the day coming when folks are going to go home again, and some will. But it's very hard to know really what's a realistic expectation. And in a place like Syria, it's not as if what we would hope, eventually the actual fighting stops. It isn't as if there's going to be, buses putting people back in Aleppo, which is basically flat, in the near future. So how long? 10 years? 5 years? 20 years? I mean, what is the, and how do people return home again? You know, refugee status is a very complex one, and it's still debated in Scandinavia. Yeah, I think I'm going to use.
Yeah, the portable might, yeah, it won't go to her.
Can you hear me?
Testing.
I'll come closer.
Yeah, it helps. Thanks a lot to both of you, really. Eric for his sobering comments all the time, also, which I appreciate too. I do think it's important when we're talking about these issues in the Scandinavian context to have in mind that it's a very contradictory situation. When you're talking in terms of this increase in securitization and the hostility from the Danish side and increasingly from the Norwegian side as well, it's not a very accurate picture in many ways. I mean, it's very complex. And Norway actually, until the refugee crisis, was the country in the world with the highest rate of immigration, higher than all the classic immigration countries on earth, higher than Sweden even, per capita. After the refugee crisis, Norway is number 3 or something like that. I mean, immigration has been enormous, and the rate, I mean, you have to really take that in, what that does to a society. And we see you have political reactions to this. This is dangerous. I mean, if it's not going to be handled in the right way, considering the contextual tools and the contextual parameters, it's going to be nasty. You already see that. The reactions in Sweden has been striking to that effect. And the same in Norway and Denmark. So it's not the question only to be happy and say we should see the potential, not the threats, etc. This is very, very complex. So I have never liked the concept securitization. When Ole Weber introduced it long time before it was really a very accurate problem, I felt that this is what can you use it for? I mean, it's a very normative concept, and it needs to be contextualized. And I do think today, when we're talking in terms of securitization, in line with what Eric said, you need, I think, to introduce a juridical concept. Proportionality, I think, is extremely important, because we need security. I mean, there's no doubt about it. But is it proportional? And what does it do to our society when we add it up, sort of? I think these questions need to be addressed. They're very, very important. And when does securitization turn into something illegitimate? I mean, this is supposed to be controlled by democratic mechanisms also in our societies. And then lastly, this dichotomy, potential versus threat. I mean, as I tried to say yesterday, I mean, the whole Nordic model approach wants to see newcomers as potential citizens. I mean, the whole integration, the necessity of integrating people to have the system remain is really a question of making citizens. But, on the other hand, the number coming in and the rate, the immigration rate, is extremely important to avoid this threat feeling. Yeah. So absorption capacity is a very, very central concept. And systemically, we need citizens. And people are seen as potential citizens. I mean, not by everybody, politically speaking, but I mean, systemically, they are potential citizens the very moment they are accepted as residents. But if there are too many of them at the same time, it's going to cause problems. Thank you.
I saw another hand and then I'll respond.
Was there something
Yeah,
else?
right there. Do you want to respond directly? Okay.
I don't know if I need that. Can you hear me if I speak like this?
Not really.
Stand up. No, I think you better.
Hello? Okay, good.
Yes.
This is just like a small comment on what you were saying and what you were saying, considering like potential and securitization. I think that it's pretty clear and important to remember that words have meaning, and I think that as soon as we start to label things in a certain way, it takes away from the potential that we want to bring out. So I think those things kind of can possibly go against each other, even though it's not meant to. And even though I understand what you're saying concerning, like, we have to protect our borders, but I mean even the word protect, it's a signal that the people that are coming are a threat. And how can you then turn a threat into a potential if you kind of have the notion that it's a threat to begin with? So I think, again, it's very, very, it feeds into what you're doing, which is really, really important, like the role of the state. Because if the state says that we're not a multicultural state, that's a very clear signal. And I think we've seen it in the US in a very drastic way, that words coming from a higher instance tend to sort of legitimize what people do in their everyday lives. And it's been very dramatic since the election here, but I don't think it's not happening in the Scandinavian countries. Speaking of like how you define your country will trickle down. So I think like the role of the state, again.
Yeah, I think the tension, and I will say this, you know, Peter's presentation talked about how work is received. I mean, I've received very negative criticisms from within Scandinavian scholars, because I think it's hard to have this conversation, but it is one that has to happen. I mean, if the society is changing, and the society is changing, integration is not a one-way street, where one person just becomes magically tabula rasa, and now you're magically Danish. It doesn't work like that. It hasn't worked like that in anybody who studies race and assimilation. So having, and I'm not saying I have all the answers either. I'm saying the conversation needs to be had. What will this society look like now that it looks different? And what sort of systems in place are going to either be maintained, transformed? The conversation isn't being had. And I know there are scholars who will say, it is, but it's had on a level of how can we make these populations fall in line? And that's not necessarily the conversations those populations necessarily want to have. It might, I don't know where the balance is. I agree, I mean, if you look at immigration in the US context, of course, learning English, you know, certain populations acquiring religious traditions. If we look at the Catholics and the history of Catholic migration, Italians and Irish were seen as non-white largely on the basis of religion. I mean, again, history is repeating itself, and that's my point. We need to have the conversation, and the conversation is not happening on a very real level. I think it's happening in a very one-way system, but it's not happening in a dynamic way. That it's a dynamic process that both change as the society changes, the person as well as the process and the site and location. Again, that's probably my sociology coming through, but you have to talk that through. Wow, now hand shot it. Okay, bring it.
I hate to draw, because what you just said was very, very eloquent, and kind of advances the discussion in a different direction, so I hate to like pull us back into what was just going on here, but I think if we are to see the limitations of you know, kind of the powers of framing and the potential that putting a more positive edge on immigration can take, I have to think that what happened in 2015 is one of those examples, because the issues that were that were motivating a very, very dramatic turn in immigration policy, especially in Sweden, an unbelievable U-turn of immigration policy. I mean, we were talking about vast numbers of immigrants not having a place to stay in a society that places equality of treatment as you know, perhaps it's in its new postmodern defining post-national national identity. You know, no capacity in hospitals, no capacity in schools. The question of statelessness almost doesn't come to the forefront because the actual receiving agencies, the police, the migration agency in southern Sweden, did not have, in many cases, any sort of control over who was, or notion of who was in the country. So paperlessness and undocumented status takes on a new meaning in that context. So when you're confronting factors like that, that's when I become a bit of a cynic about the power of calling this an opportunity versus a threat. Even though, of course, we would, I think the former is preferable. There are all those reasons, but we're becoming a bit too idealistic when we're confronting issues that tangible, that concrete. And it's also, I mean, in the same breath as we talk about the power of instrumentalizing the new talent and the new insights that are coming into a country, and a comparison was made to Colombia. It's also something that especially the more materialist-minded scholars and commentators of society need to bear in mind, that the support for anti-immigrant movements, whether it is Brexit, whether it's Trump, whether it is the nationalist movements throughout Europe, does not always confine to economically based explanations. There are so many examples in which economically stable people will either adopt very xenophobic positions in ways that aren't explained by their situation, or that will, in even greater contrast, will vote in ways that will damage them economically for the sake of identity battles and for nationalism. So, a comment.
I'll meet you halfway. Run a relay here.
I guess I just had a contribution to overall the kind of discussion about threat versus opportunity. And I was thinking when Greta was responding, like from an American perspective, maybe it's really hard to see the perspective of people who are, you know, a part of these Scandinavian societies, and maybe the immigration does feel like a threat, and refusing to acknowledge that people feel threatened doesn't make that feeling go away.
I don't. I see it. I do.
Yeah.
And again, I'm just offering a point of view from the outside.
Yeah.
So most of my respondents and my own experience of living there as a non-white immigrant who went through the integration program. So I don't put my perspective as the perspective. I'm just saying it's another perspective. It's a point of view that is often discounted and not discussed, which is the view from the outside. I get why I go through Danish and Swedish history, and I get it, why there is a feeling of protection of that identity. But I say that doesn't negate the experience from the outside too. Both are happening simultaneously with very little communication across.
Yeah, I think that's what it was.
I'm sorry.
I'm
sorry.
Was kind of that, like, it's interesting because you could say, like, as an American scholar, we're like from a society that's the worst case scenario for, like, if you don't manage any of this, what happens to you? You turn out with problems that we're facing now, right? Like, none of this was managed when immigration happened on a much larger scale historically in this country. And even like here in southern New England, you were mentioning the Catholic immigrations from Europe and different immigrations controls. Like I drove over the Calvin Coolidge Bridge to get here. Calvin Coolidge, big proponent of exclusion of immigration from Asian countries, right? So like we've been dealing with this for a long time, and that doesn't like give us necessarily any kind of like definitive perspective on it, but it's interesting to consider like, what is the result? Like, what is the threat? The threat of what happening? And I don't know. I haven't really like over the course of the talks, been thinking about that until now, and like, I'm not sure, like, what is the threat? Is the threat terrorism? Because that's like, obviously one thing that people talk about, right, and is in the news, in terms of like, what could happen? Or what is it a threat of? So I was just like wondering maybe if anybody, because a lot of people here are qualified, I'm sure, to answer that question. Like, how do we identify that? And like, a threat to whom? Because obviously, people coming as refugees are necessarily under a very serious threat. That's why they become refugees. So, yeah, I think maybe being a little bit more specific about that. Yes, there's positive and negative ways to frame things, but being more specific about what these threats are, why people, who feels them and why, maybe could help advance the discussion a little bit.
And I'll put up the room to that one.
I don't know if you want to respond. My comment actually almost directly follows. So I think when we're talking about threats versus opportunities, it may be helpful to think about there being two different kinds of discourse. There's a discourse on immigrants as threats, right? So individual immigrants as a threat, as a potential criminal or terrorist, right? Or something along those lines, versus immigration as a threat, right? Immigration is a systemic threat, which is, I think, what Greta is really talking about. She's not talking about, well, these are bad people who are coming in and you know, at least I assume, these are bad people who are coming in and are going to do bad things because they don't like to work and they don't, you know, and they're going to cause crime, right? That's immigrants as a threat. I think we need to, if we're really want to be able to talk about the threats to the welfare system, for instance, we need to be able to say that's not what we're saying. What we're saying is that immigration, because of its the sheer numbers, right? And some characteristics of the students, but immigration is the threat, not individual immigrants.
Can I have just a brief comment on that?
No, definitely, and I'm not talking in terms of immigration being a threat either. It depends on all sorts of things. I mean, the basic thing in the Scandinavian context is to have people be included in the labor market. And of course, it's also important to include people in the spheres of society, etc., etc. But if we're talking in terms of the sustainability of the welfare state as such, which was the theme of yesterday, then having people included into the labor market is absolutely central. And threat to whom is a very good question.
Yeah.
And in fact, what we see now in Norway, after this extremely high immigration rate since 2004, is that the people who are in fact threatened are earlier immigrants in particular, and people at the lowest brackets of the labor system. People who are confronted with low wage competition through this comprehensive immigration of people with too low qualifications for the demand structure of the Norwegian labor market. So we are actually talking about a threat to the protection system that really serves the most vulnerable people in society most. So this is a serious humanitarian issue, really. So the question, who is under threat? I mean, I very rarely use the word threat because I think it does something to discussions, and I don't think it's pertinent either, the way the situation is at present. But if we talk in terms of who feels the threat, definitely the most vulnerable people in the Scandinavian societies.
Well, maybe we ought to let Nicole.
Hi, I could probably make my voice heard. So in the case of Denmark and like countries that are participants in the European Union, do you think there's a requirement for being a multicultural state?
No. But it's an interesting question to pose. Not that I'm aware of any
way of legislating that or enforcing that. Wow, that's a big question. We have to unpack some of the, as we said before, the Swedish, constitution. You have to look at sort of every nation building process to see if there is some degree. Somebody else jump in if you're, but I would say you have to look at each nation building process rather, to see if that's a goal and not necessarily. And I'm not advocating, and I guess I want to be clear to say, I'm not advocating that it should be. I'm simply, again, and this paper is not really where I make this point as expressly, but I do want to talk about the citizenship literature. Certainly in terms of our conversations in sociology, there's that sort of post-national school of thought, really did see sort of the EU and this idea of freedom of movement of people and the potential of that to eradicate the need for borders, eradicate the need for passports. Yasmin Sosal's work and others in that sort of, Saskia Sassen's work and sort of that idea of global cities and I know, and again, the skepticism exists even in sociology. So I'm not necessarily advocating rainbows and everybody just walks freely through the planet. We definitely need security. I don't de-emphasize that. And that's why I said my co-editor and I are really struggling with our intro chapter because we don't want to go down the road, his discourse in literature in the theoretical side of criminal justice, he's not on the applied side, but this term securitization is used very explicitly in those works. And they're talking about it in a post-9/11 context and talking about it very much concretely on the enforcement side of this. And so we, as editors of this volume, are struggling with, he's trying to compete against the discourse in his area of expertise to say it can't be essentialized down to police at the borders with no papers and how to manage that. And then my folks who are saying we don't even need to talk about states because, so we're trying to sort of unpack and maybe we're doing too much in one volume, but we're trying to sort of move a conversation in a way that says that's one-dimensional thinking. All of these pieces are intertwined and are increasingly becoming more and more complex as we start to examine those contexts and conditions for these things happening. So that's our broader goal, if that makes sense.
On that note, I
I know, I'll never get you
think we should thank,
Thank you.
we should thank Nicole and